So I needed to write, I needed to be working on a novel while I was in this program. And I had tried and, failed to write a couple of novels previously. I maybe would get 3 or 4 chapters in and then things would peter out. So I needed something fresh. And because I didn't know what I was doing, I knew I didn't know how to write a full novel. I figured I should write what I knew. So I was in my early 30s at the time, and I felt like I had, a fair amount of perspective on my early 20s. So I said, okay, I'm going to write about a woman who is in her early 20s and struggling to figure out life. And I knew that was going to be my jumping off point. My background prior to writing this book was in recruiting and human resources. So I figured, okay, I've talked to a lot of people who are struggling in their careers and trying to figure things out. I'm going to apply that knowledge here. So that was the first seeds of Dear Dotty. And then as I started getting to know my main character, Rosie Benson, she's pretty lost and she can be frustrating at times to follow, which I think is very true to a lot of people in their early 20s and beyond. And I thought how cool it would be if she had someone in her family who was very self-assured and had lived life in a very different way to sort of light the way for her. So that's where Dottie came from. I don't think that I don't know where I would be if I hadn't been in a writing program. As I was writing this book, it might have turned into another story that just kind of floundered a quarter of the way in. It was great because as I was writing this story, I was learning about craft and the structure of a novel, and I was reading other writers' work. And there's something so valuable in providing feedback to other writers because it forces you to examine what works and what doesn't and pinpoint maybe why. And that's a skill that you absolutely have to apply to your own work, something I hadn't quite developed yet. So it was really, really helpful. The flip side of that is I think I wrote a lot more slowly than I would have if I wasn't in a writing program because I would submit, 50, 100 pages at a time, and then I would get feedback. And then inevitably, I would feel discouraged or I would feel inspired, and I would go back and rework what I had already done. So it was a 2-year program, and it took me 2 years to finish that first draft. I remember being, the first couple of years out of college and experiencing all these interesting changes in my friendships, be it friends' parents getting divorced out of nowhere, or, people coupling off and moving in with significant others or moving across the country. I have a friend that, went and lived in Australia for a year and worked at a comedy shop. There was a whole spectrum of experiences. And so I wanted to capture that for Rosie. It can be kind of a disorienting time because, when you're in college or high school, however far you take your education, everything's pretty structured. And then once you come out the other side, it's, a wide open field. So that's kind of where Rosie's coming from. She is someone who grew up in a pretty traditional family. She has an older brother who is an attorney. He's very successful. He's married. He has a baby on the way. They just bought a ridiculously expensive home in their childhood neighborhood. And Rosie is trying to make it in sales, and she's very, very bad at it. And she's trying to do all the things that she thinks she's supposed to do, and it's not quite fitting for her. Dottie, on the other hand, has lived a really unconventional life. She never got married. She never had children. Both of those were by choice. She's lived all around the world, had an eclectic career. She currently works as a travel writer. And yeah, she's kind of that quintessential kooky great aunt. And so Rosie never feels quite at home in her own family, except when Dottie's there. Dottie's the person that makes her feel like it's okay to be her. And what I love about Dottie, the more I got to know her, Dottie is not, offbeat or irreverent for the sake of being those things. She's just being true to herself. And so there's other characters in the novel, mostly Rosie's family members who are more traditional, and Dottie's quite supportive of them too, because her outlook on life is you've got to do what's right for you. And if that looks really traditional, fantastic. And if it looks completely nuts to the outside world, but it feels right to you, great. I come from a larger family. My dad's side of the family is Italian. I have a ton of cousins and great aunts and uncles. And so I personally have experienced loss, you know, certainly more than someone in a smaller family typically does. I It's interesting because when I was first working on the novel, Dottie didn't die until like 3/4 of the way through. And when I went back to revise that first draft, I realized she needed to die sooner. Like, we needed to see Rosie grappling with that grief because that is where her growth comes from. So, in terms of using Dottie's passing to propel Rosie's story forward, I think because Rosie is so immature and lost when we first meet her, and typically you don't grow just because someone tells you to do something differently or gives you really great advice, as Dottie has been doing for Rosie throughout her whole life. You have to do it yourself. And so taking Dottie away from Rosie and really forcing her to figure this out on her own was really powerful. I've having experienced grief myself, I felt like I could speak to that in the book. And something that I've thought about a lot too with, people I've lost is how nice it would have been to get to know them as an adult, because the way that yeah, I know they must have struggled, right, when they were younger, but I only knew them until I was a teenager, and I don't know what their lives looked like. I don't know what their struggles were, and I wish I had had the chance to ask them that. And so for Rosie, a lot of her journey is reaching out to people who knew Dottie in different ways and learning about her aunt that way and getting the full picture of Dottie and then being able to apply that to her life. So in terms of if you're trying to write a story that, centers around grief or has a storyline where there's loss, um, I think the key is to really think about how it's going to change your character. Like, what does losing this person mean to them? And how will it make them grow? How will they react? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And how is that going to amplify them? And yeah, you can do quite a lot with it.